Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Podcast Digest. My name's Dan Lizette. This is episode 146. And before I get started this week, I want to just take a quick moment and thank a couple of people, those wonderful folks over on Patreon who support me and this show directly. There's a link in the show notes if you're interested in helping out the Podcast Digest to do that over on Patreon. But also to returning sponsor this week, my friends over at Podbean, podcast hosting and monetization. If you check out podbean.com/TPD, you'll get your first month for free. And I'll tell you more about all the awesome stuff that Podbean offers in just a little while. But in the meantime, let's get back to this week's show. This week's show is a big one. Why? I'm returning with a full, long-form interview with a great podcast host. My guest this week is Sook-Yin Lee from CBC's Sleepover, one of the most unique shows, honestly, that you will find. Why do I say that? Well, we talk all about it. It involves getting people together in a hotel room in 24 hours and all kinds of unique stuff, just stuff that you're not hearing on podcasts really any other way. And we dove deep into where the idea came for this and what it's like to put something like this together. And Sook-Yin was a great guest to talk to. And just, I really wish I could have like 3 times as long to talk with her because she's a great conversationalist, obviously, with this type of show, but also really a creative whirlwind and a great mind for this type of work. So it was a thrill to sit down and talk to her, as it is to bring you our conversation, which I'll do right now. So without further ado, my conversation with Sook-Yin Lee from Sleepover. Hello, folks. Welcome back. As I mentioned up front, my guest this week, very excited to talk to a host of a CBC radio show and podcast, I guess is the correct label, but I found it as a podcast, Sook-Yin Lee from Sleepover. Welcome to the Podcast Digest.
Greetings, Dan Lizette.
Thanks for joining me, and I really appreciate the time. I actually think I first ever heard about your show from a crew that was representing CBC at Podcast Movement last year in Chicago, and I found a lot of great ones. Former guests Love Me with the Crystal and Mira from Love Me, and I spoke with them recently about Pen Pals, and so I've been in contact with CBC, and they said season 2's coming out, you got to check it out, and I've been on board ever since and loving it. So thank you very much.
Right on. I'm glad you found it.
So I usually start these conversations with a, before the podcast started, tell folks a little bit about yourself. Now, in my preparation for this conversation today, in looking at your library of things you've done as, let's call it a creative person, there's so many things, and we could probably fill up all of our time just talking about those things. So I think what I'll ask you is this. Sure. Besides a podcast, what are some of these other things that you've worked on, that you've been a part of, that really have been special experiences for you in your past?
Yeah, well, I think of myself as just like I love making stuff. So that started when I was a kid, and it's all sort of an extension of that creative spark that you have as a child, making imaginary worlds and coming up with things and playing and so forth. So I think as an adult, in terms of making work, I started off making art. So my initial discipline was music as a musician, an independent musician, and spent a great deal of time loving making music and traveling and touring, and that's one thing that I do. And then I also make films. That seemed to be something that I started doing. A lot of this stuff was back when I was a disaffected and introverted teenager. Turning to expression really helped me communicate and express myself. So that's when I started to make videos and short films. And so really loved to make that. And then in the last few years, I've been able to go on to make not only short films, but also feature movies. I also am a TV and radio broadcaster. I worked at Much Music, which is kind of like MTV in the United States. I was a VJ on Much Music. I also choreograph dance and work with dancers and tell live theater, kind of quasi-stories, experimental stories. And what else do I swim. I love swimming. I swim quite a bit. And, of course, I make radio.
I've looked through the about pages and the various different summaries of your prior work, and I'm thinking to myself, what haven't you done might actually be a better question. I feel like there's got to be like an incoming book at some point. I don't know that you've tapped into that world yet.
Well, I really love writing, and I tend to, I enjoy script writing. So, writing the script for a movie is very different from prose or a book.
Right.
And I seem to be able to embody that pretty well. Actual writing, I tend to really be picky. And so I find myself really working over the prose writing that I feel like maybe sometime in the future. And I think my style tends to be extremely spare. And so funnily enough, sometimes that spare writing comes from, you have to really distill down. So that's sort of one of those things that one day I'd love to be able to write a book, but I think it will be quite a distillation process. And I feel like, that's not a genre that comes as readily to me. Also,
right.
Rapping. I would love to be a rapper, and I'd love to be a stand-up comedian. But man, oh man, those are intimidating forms. I'd love to be able to do that. I'd love to be able to read a manual. I can't read manuals. I can't read instructions very well.
So you still have a to-do list, is what you're saying?
Yes. I need to learn how to drive. I don't know how to drive.
Oh,
I ride my bike. It's terrible. I know it would be game over. I've played too many video games where the car is, I'm in a car, the car is flipped within 10 seconds. So
I'm thinking to
I don't
myself,
want that happening.
You also have a fairly extensive acting background.
It's true.
Any of these roles, you didn't have to drive in any of the roles?
Oh, I did, and it was a disaster, let me tell you. Dan,
boy.
It was like, when I was a young person in Vancouver as a kid and a teenager, I got a lot of work in crummy TV shows. And so one of them was like, it was pretty bad. It was like I was a student who was grandfather is a firecracker maker, and he accidentally concocts explosives. So these explosions go around in the city, and they think that there's a terrorist, but it's my grandfather, and I'm a science student. Anyway, it was completely cliched, and when you're an actor. And especially when you're an actor and a person of color, you tend to, all the roles that I got cast in for TV were like Jade.
Right.
The name was Jade, or I was, a lady of the night, or a science student.
Every stereotype imaginable.
Every stereotype imaginable. And so that one time they told me I had to drive and discard these firecrackers, explosives into a dumpster. And so I arrived to set, and they had said that they'd give me an automatic car, but it was a standard, and I didn't know how to ride it, and I ended up careening, almost like mowing people over in craft services, and then going to the left but smashing into the dumpster.
Wow.
So
yeah, most people when they're learning to drive or early in their driving life don't tend to have those failures in front of a whole crew of people.
Well, so I loved making movies, and I was a TV addict and a film addict when I was a kid, and loved to make those, and then was able to make some money going out for these cruddy TV shows. But then I realized that I really didn't like being a part of those projects. So I started to make my own movies, and I started to take classes as a student in high school, video and film and drama, and those were all life-saving classes for me. And so I ended up just kind of making my own work, and then sometimes casting myself or casting my friends in my movies, and then also working on filmmaker friends, their movies. So yeah, I have been an actor as well, but I pick and choose my roles wisely, and really only take part in things that I really love.
Well, it like I said, I could talk about your back catalog for a lot of time, but all of this just sort of setting the backdrop for Sleepover. So let's go through this completely unique listening experience. For anyone who hasn't heard it yet, you're missing out. Subscribe now, and because this is not your typical radio or podcast show. It's very different. So let's go back to the beginning. How did this get started? How did your involvement with the project begin? Whose idea was it? Let's talk about the early days.
Yeah, so I work at CBC Radio 1, and that is kind of like public broadcasting in Canada, similar to BBC or NPR. And the show that I had been hosting and co-producing for many years ended, and it was a personal storytelling show. It was called DNTO. And at that time, the manager said to me, well, there's a space open. We want you to come up with an idea for a show. You have 2 weeks to do it. Go. And I was like,
Wow.
Gulp. Usually there's more of a gestation period.
Sure.
But sometimes the best ideas come, in these kinds of pressure-filled moments, and also when you unlock your unconscious and you have a kind of like, you can access interesting ideas. And so everything coalesced pretty quickly. Sometimes the best songs are written in 15 minutes. Sometimes the best ideas come to you like a great inspiration in a moment. And it certainly happened with that. And I think with Sleepover, basically the premise is that I invite 3 different strangers, 3 people who would never otherwise find themselves together, different ages, beliefs, backgrounds, cultures, incomes, could not be more different. And I find three individuals, and they meet me at a secret location, and together we spend 24 hours together. And at some point in that 24-hour span, each of the people brings to the conversation a difficulty that they're wrestling with in their lives. And the other 2 strangers and myself offer, from our completely different perspectives, advice of how that person can deal with whatever is challenging for them. And so the inspiration, the idea of durational experience came from it was an experimental theater performance that I had taken part in and helped to co-create about a year earlier. It was part of the SummerWorks Theater Festival in Toronto. And what had happened was we decided for a durational time, me and my partner would spend 24 hours in a black box, essentially a room with no windows, all black. Down the hall were 2 other co-creators, and they were in a room, and the only way that they would communicate with us was through a laptop situated inside our black box. And for that 24-hour period, they would give us exercises and directives to fulfill. So it was sort of a random chance exercise where at the same time we would draw from a hat the duration of time. It would be either an action that we would fulfill for 20 seconds up to 8 hours long. Weird little things that they asked us to do. And I found it interesting in that durational exercise that at first I became extremely fatigued. It was really hard physically and mentally, but there came a point where I surpassed that fatigue and became highly alert and highly energized. And through this 24-hour period, as opposed to slumping over and falling asleep, we actually became very acutely focused and perceptive. To the end of a 24-hour cycle, we found ourselves being given the directive to draw a picture and then show that particular picture to one another, and we had both drawn the same thing. And we were
wow.
What? Well, are we now psychic?
Yeah.
Anyway, then at the end of the 24-hour cycle, we unlocked the doors and invited the public in, and we performed a music performance for them. So again, that performance was vivid and clear and singular and grounded, and it really thwarted my expectations. I thought I was going to be an oily puddle on the ground, not making any sense. In fact, what happened was the opposite. And so I really came to think about this idea of duration. And so with Sleepover, I love this notion. I mean, it's not like the arduous performance that I did where we did not sleep. Of course, the guests are able to sleep, but we all sleep together in the same room. But what happens is so much of the kinds of conversations that take place in media, the things that we package and present for people, they're on a very tertiary level because, a person is on a press junket. They maybe have a window of 15 minutes to talk to you. There's only so far deep you can go. But when you are together in a room, you can't help it. Like your true colors shine after a while because you can't keep up the facade. And so what happens is a sort of breakthrough in our presentational selves to go to a deeper level, which I'm interested in. I'm also interested in seeing, I had been quite frustrated and distracted and kind of demoralized by a lot of the kind of interaction I was seeing on social media. I mean, social media is great in so many facets where we're able to speak to one another instantaneously, but at the same time, I was seeing interesting conversations suddenly spiral into really big feuds, suddenly becoming like gang warfare on a thread, and finally seeing a lot of people who were just at odds with each other, name calling, and the conversation digressing to a really not very useful place. So, I really wanted to, instead of talking through technology, sort of try to create a space where people could meet one another face to face, and you couldn't just leave. You had to sort of be present and kind of co-create a kind of atmosphere with one another for a 24-hour period. I thought this was really great. I didn't know what would happen, but I really wanted to make a space for that to happen. And then also, I just see, in the world, so many people in standoffs with one another based upon seeming difference. And although we do celebrate differences and we are all very different people, very little is talked about how unifying we are, and how humans really find a lot of identity and can identify with one another. So I really wanted to create a place where you could take very different people and see what kind of conversations could come up, and as opposed to being around your own the friends that you see every day, and then you all have the same kinds of ideas. What would happen if you kind of mix it up a bit and curated a group of people who really seemingly are so vastly different and yet can provide a very valuable insight to each other.
Hey folks, let me jump in here and tell you a little bit about this week's show sponsor on the Podcast Digest. This week's show is brought to you by my friends over at Podbean. Podcast hosting and monetization is the easiest way to get started, folks. And let me tell you why. And it's been a few weeks since I've had a chance to tell you about Podbean, and they've just got so many great things going on right now that if you are thinking about starting your own podcast, or you're looking for a new home for your existing show, there is a ton of value in what Podbean is offering. So let's talk about some of those things, right? You're, of course, going to get the website, customizable themes and colors, sharing out to the socials, all of the socials. They just added YouTube to do that as well, along with Facebook and Twitter and Tumblr, WordPress. They even have several WordPress integrations in terms of plugins and auto sharing, and with the same embedded player on your WordPress site as well. There's monetization options as well if you want listeners to support you directly, or maybe you want to put together a super special episode and ask people for 99 cents or something like that. Podbean has the infrastructure in place to support all of this, to put you in contact directly with advertisers. They recruit advertisers regularly, and you have an opportunity to suggest your show for their advertising platform. They've got all the statistics you would ever possibly want. It's all right there in Podbean when you host with them. They can set you up in iTunes. They can import your show from another platform. You offer applications, mobile apps for both Android and iOS. Just all kinds of great features. And I'm not even exaggerating. There's tons of stuff that Podbean has to offer. You'll be a part of their directory, which will allow, they do promotions on their social channels, on their website as well. It's all available from podbean.com. So what do you do to look into this? Want to give it a try? Go to podbean.com/TPD. That's for the Podcast Digest. It lets them know that you came from this show. If you sign up with that, you're going to be able to get your first month for free, guys. First month for free. You can literally import your show, release a few episodes, try the whole thing, and not even be out a dime. It's worth trying. I strongly encourage you guys to check it out. So my thanks to Podbean for once again supporting the Podcast Digest. Yeah, and that commonality is a huge takeaway from anyone who starts to listen to Sleepover. But you mentioned that you didn't know what would happen. And when you just sort of have a bullet point description of this show idea during this 2-week challenge, you had to come up with it. There had to be either a thought in the back of your mind or some other people with CBC that said, wow, this has a high potential to go sideways. And I'm curious, like, how, what type of foresight or what type of conversations around potential issues? I mean, obviously everybody who's there is volunteering and they understand the premise and they come there willingly. So that obviously would mitigate some of the concern. But is there a concern just in terms of a dud of a product at some point?
Well, I mean, I was lucky at that time because the person who asked me to create the show really believes that, make the show you love. And so, of course, I would consider how to piece it together so that, there is a risk. It's not so you are walking into a situation of which not everybody knows the outcome. And that's part of the beauty of it. But at the same time, there is a structure, there is a setup. It's, I try to mitigate and create as safe as a space for people to get vulnerable as possible. And so certainly, finding the right guests, coming, bringing them together, making I guess, you don't want somebody who's not very talkative or is very closed off. That would be difficult. So there are certain kind of qualities that I'm looking for in a guest to be, I would never force anyone to be there if they don't want to be there. Everybody who's there wants to be there and understands there's a kind of mutual understanding and contract that we make with one another, that we are pulling together in this situation. And so, in terms of, I think it was through kind of the beauty of independent thought and creativity and the support of an idea that helped make it happen. And it's also a very small crew. So my collaborators so I essentially came up with this idea, and I knew that I think the best ideas have a very good design. So you need to have a good design. So the notion of problem solving gives one a directive. We are there to try to help one another solve a particular problem. So therein lies a kind of direction, right? There's an action, there's a goal. But at the same time, there are durational aspects, a 24-hour period. In this first season, it was everybody met me at a specific hotel. And then as we go, we're recording everything. There's no audience. So unlike reality shows that bear some similarities, unlike, say, Big Brother or something like that, there is no audience. There is no technical crew behind the scenes. There is all of us taking part. And my crew is tiny. It's me and two other people in the room, and then as well as the three guests, and sometimes the parents of children. Always the parents of a child. We have somebody. If it's a minor, we have their guardian there. So there's no peer person just sitting there watching and not being involved. Everybody is involved, and so therein lies a kind of you're working together in a true way. There's no kind of objectification, like somebody's safe and doesn't have to reveal or physically bring themselves forward. So that notion that, so we're gathering tape for 24 hours and then we go away with a massive amount of tape. And me and my two collaborators, we sit down afterwards and we go, okay, what was that? What was the best arc of the story? Because you could go in many different ways, but we have to identify what was the sort of through line for each person. Each of the guests are they're represented in an episode. So one sleepover equals 3 half-hour episodes, and we sort of go sequentially through the period as time advances. So will the next episode. So it becomes, there's sort of two kind of existences for this. There's what happens in the room, which is very, 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 very special. And I wish that more people could take part in this and know what that is like. But it's something extraordinary to experience. And I feel very privileged. And I feel like all of us in the room feel privileged to partake in that. So there's that. But then the reduction, the distillation of what has occurred in order to sort of create the podcast and, edit it down to a fine gem that accurately reflects how things went. So that's the second part. That's the Sleepover podcast or radio show of which we offer to the world to listen to.
Yeah, and how this all comes together were just several of the questions I had for you, and one of them was you mentioned earlier about finding the guests, and they had to have certain qualities, and obviously there's intent in pairing together those who are coming from fairly different, age groups, cultural backgrounds, etc., to find that through line. So what is sort of the recruiting solicitation process for finding these guests, and take us through sort of how these folks are selected?
Sure. Well, again, it's very open. So as opposed to trying to come up with a systemology that you have to answer a questionnaire or only go by one particular route, we really break it open. So, we've been able to cast people based upon me walking around town, striking up an interesting conversation in the food court with a guy who's making me some food in the food court who tells me about his brother, who sounds really interesting. And then he introduces me to his brother, who is indeed interesting. And, I invite him to sleep over. And he says yes.
That's how all the guests were found in person?
No.
Oh, okay. I was going to say.
One way. One way is just me trundling through the world and happening upon interesting people, crossing paths with interesting people or people who know other people. Literally just wandering around in the world. Then there's also the way that we specifically know that I'm looking for this. I really wanted to, we did a live sleepover event.
Yes.
And it was sort of an adaptation of the 24 hours experience, and we reduced it to 90 minutes on a giant stage in front of an audience at the Hot Docs Podcast Festival in Toronto. And I knew that for that one, I would really have to have some extroverted people. Because it's a live show, so you can't be totally snoozy about it. So I knew wrestlers are very interesting to me. Wrestlers are very, very interesting. So that was like, okay, that'd be cool. I wonder if we could find somebody who's a wrestler with an interesting dilemma. And surely, my producers and I went out and went online, asked people, myriad ways of trying to track down the right wrestler, and we found him, and he's amazing and great. Cody Deaner.
Yes, that was a great...
He has an interesting problem. He clubs people for a living, but his toddler son, Abel, doesn't know the difference between play fighting and real fighting, and now his little guy's a bully and beating people up, and he's trying to figure out how he can, teach his kid the difference. So, he was great, and he just came through in spades within that context. Some people, I just outreach and call schools up, talk with teachers, talk with principals, talk with other students if I'm trying to find a child or a teenager. And then there's sometimes where we have a listener line where people can call in and, say what their dilemma is, and so we can choose from the array of people that phone in. So far, we've only chosen one from the listener line, and it was not somebody who phoned herself. It was somebody who phoned on behalf of this person who's very, very extraordinary. So somebody had called and said, "There's this amazing woman I met. You've got to check her out, Erin Faye Franz." And then so we found her and we reached out and described what the show was, and she was on board. So there's all very many ways. I knew that I had, for the second season, as opposed to meeting me in the same hotel room in Toronto, we decided to go further afield and do some traveling and sort of go to a location that could become the backdrop or a kind of secondary character to this experience. And so we ended up going to Vancouver, which is it's a modern city at a cultural crossroad where there's a huge difference between the rich and poor living side by side, and it's very stark. And it's quite disturbing to see. And so I thought that it would be very important for us to cast people that kind of reflect some of the fabric of the city and some of the struggles and issues that the city is exposed to. And so I knew that I wanted to have somebody who's part of the development, either a real estate developer, a home builder, somebody who's contributed to the changing architectural landscape of the city, and who's very wealthy. And so, often on public radio, we don't feature those voices, or those voices are kind of presented in a fairly reductive way, or people are just, people are just asked for their, 45-second opinion on something, but rarely do we see the sort of lives of the wealthy and the conundrums they may experience. And so that was really challenging to find somebody who would come on board there. We found a lot of very interesting, extremely wealthy people with very rich problems who would talk to us ad nauseum about their problems. And then when I finally said, well, are you down now? Will you meet me? No, my people have told me that I can't. I just can't, like, they would want to, but they're, finally one guy said, Sook-Yin, you don't understand. Nobody feels sorry for a guy with a museum. And it's true. Yeah. We don't. So I thought, maybe there's some sort of cultural assumption there that's very important to explore a bit. And so I eventually found a fellow who there was an article in a small magazine that was essentially making fun of him. They were making fun of him because he was a guy who created a meetup group called Millionaires Under 40 because he wanted to find a bro friend, a buddy to travel the world and, go to all these, the World Cup and Ibiza and like do all these wealthy world travels, but he couldn't find a bud. And so this particular magazine just trashed him, and they're like, shut up, guy. And, they're really pretty terrible to him. But I was like, who is this guy? And then I did a bit more research and then found him and then was able to have a conversation with him and described, what it was that I was hoping to achieve with Sleepover, if he would be involved. As I spoke with him, I found, holy smokes, this guy's really got a very interesting story and something that I would never have guessed ever. And he bravely, even though he had been bitten by the media previously, he took the leap of faith and joined us, and it was very, very, very interesting. I coupled him with a couple of people, a young gal. She's 13. She's a local hero in Vancouver in that she's trans, and that she was able to have her Catholic school change the rules around, forcing people to wear or go to gender specific bathrooms and so forth, and wear male or female clothing. Her name is True Wilson. And then there is another young woman who's sort of like a millennial who's juggling several jobs. And she doesn't have a whole lot of money. She also had difficulties with drug addiction and homelessness. And we sort of brought the three of them together. And so
it was a tremendous set of episodes there in Vancouver. That's for sure. That was one of my favorites of this season so far.
Thanks, Dan.
I want to know, from your own personal perspective, you've got the guests now. You're getting ready to attend a sleepover at whatever the location. What's running through your head? Are there nerves? Are you worried about how it might go? Or what are you sort of pep talking to yourself to put together the best kind of experience you can?
Well, what's going through my mind is I have a fairly large luggage on wheels. And, Sleepover is a very lean and mean group. I mean, it's very skeletal. And we all, I have to make sure I got all my gear in my luggage. I got to make sure that I'm also shooting videos. So Sleepover is not only a podcast, we make video, we have blogs, beautiful photographs. Veronica Simmons has been taking photos for this season 2. I've been making the videos. So just piling all my stuff in there. I bring an array of cameras, and I just want to make sure that everything's there. Really, generally, I'm just very excited. I'm so excited to meet the guests, to see how they respond to one another. There's an excited feeling when I'm waiting and waiting for them to arrive, and they're constantly surprising me, and I just love to see how people kind of roll with unforeseen difficulty, challenge, meeting new people, and trying to reach one another or connect with one another. I didn't know what would happen, and I feel very, very grateful and privileged to be able to see this unfold before me. A lot of the people, though they are different, and they may even have highly, very, very different, big differences of opinion, I see that things are workable, and I see people's incredible natures coming out, and I see their playful spirits, and I see they're very delightful to me. And we don't really get that glimpse very often. I mean, in media, especially right now. I don't know. I don't know about. I mean, it's very an anxious time. An anxious.
Hey, I'm
time.
in the U.S. It's crazy down here. Let me tell you.
So sorry for you. I mean, I'm seeing people on social media. Friends in America who are really sad.
Yeah.
Really feeling what is going on. And feeling fearful and uncertain. And I feel like, yes, there are some incredible things that are happening in our world. This is a very intense and exciting time to be alive. But I think also what gets really reinforced in our media are these, terrorizing stories. And we cast a blind eye to how incredible people are. Maybe it just doesn't sell things, to hear people are getting, actually can work together, come together, understand one another, affect one another, and feel more, satisfied. Like, I feel like, we all know that is possible, but I think we're not really, we're discouraged from expressing those things. So I feel like I didn't know what was going to happen, but this is what I saw. In the room, and this is what is heard on the show.
Yeah, the human connection comes through in each of the collection of episodes, each sleepover collection. It really does, and it sort of makes me wonder, whether during that sort of awaiting the guest arrival, or even during that evening or the next morning, do you feel, because several of them obviously struck such that powerful chord, especially on the end, where, people are saying goodbye the next morning, that type of thing. And it was clear that what just happened was awesome. I almost think these guys are going to stay in contact. They're going to be friends for life. But do you ever feel almost a performance anxiety to sort of top a previous one, or get to that same echelon of impact with these folks? Or is it just sort of you're along for the ride to whatever's going to happen is going to happen? But it just seems like there's some huge moments. And do you ever feel like a hangover from those on not being able to do it again type thing? Or?
Well, I think people are, I think what it is I tend to be an experimenter. So, this goes way, 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 way. My first movie as a short film was based upon a job that I had walking the streets of Toronto dressed as a 10-foot egg noodle, Mr. Noodle. And I got that job not because I wanted to, I needed a job. I wanted to just see what being a noodle in society would be like. And so I took that on, and it ended up inspiring so many stories, and ended up inspiring this movie. So I think there's part of me that really just loves to see what happens. And so I think, I'm curious to see what happens. It requires, if I knew each time was going to be great, then it might get boring after a while. But knowing that I'm not quite sure what's going to go on, and that we will all need to use our improvisational problem-solving skills to work together and make it happen is exciting to me. I feel like each one is different enough that I don't feel like I need to necessarily top the next one. I just feel like a kind of trusted in the exercise, and I trust in the guests. Right. They are strangers to me, but I trust them, and whatever happens, happens. It's kind of like, I feel like a lot of, we began talking about how I do many different things, different mediums and so forth, and I'm always, I love it when I can see that certain parts of my brain that I use in one medium is exactly the part of the brain that I use in another medium. Say, for example, writing a set list for a music show has everything to do with editing a movie, sequential kind of arc and feeling. And I think a lot of what Sleepover does is it borrows from my instincts as a filmmaker. When you cast characters, you cast actors in a fictional movie, you want very special people. And so when we cast real people from the world, yes, each of them is very, 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 they capture my imagination in some way, shape, or form. They don't have to be like superhuman. Sometimes they're very seemingly banal or seemingly what have you. But my expectations are always turned on their head. And I find that, one of the weaknesses of fiction and fictional movies is life is much more extraordinary. The kinds of people that you meet, on the street, in real life, the kinds of experiences that we all have in our lives, you could never dream up in fiction. And so sometimes it's like, I think the best filmmakers, movie makers, have a background in documentary. And, I feel like there's a kind of fluidity, there's a kind of borrowing of processes or kind of shared processes going on there. Exactly what, I'm not really even sure. But, there's also the feeling that I feel like Sleepover is not just about an advice or problem-solving show. That is the exterior level. That's the superficial kind of level of it. What it is it's a basket for bringing very interesting and dynamic people together to hear about life stories and life perspectives. And then also to hear people kind of interact with one another and make discoveries in that moment and do things together. And to me, that's the more kind of deeper level that is interesting.
You mentioned earlier that that earlier job dressed as a noodle walking through Toronto and how that impacted so many other Vancouver, I'm sorry, so many other projects and ultimately the first short film you worked on. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was that I have to believe that you, or maybe for the team as well, those people in that room now, wrapping up a second season at this point, this has got to be impacting you folks as well. I mean, there's got to be a personal experience to what's happening. I mean, what's it like? Because what we hear, is a 90-minute sort of summation, and I wanted to ask you sort of about that editing process in a moment, but you're getting this full experience. How has this impacted you, playing this role in this experiment?
It's very intense. I do notice in the room, I seem to be imbibed with an extra amount of adrenaline. My peers are Michelle Macklem and Veronica Simmons. And also we have a digital producer, Alana. And we in terms of being in the room itself, I have a lot of super strength. It's almost like Michelle and Veronica are like, how did you keep your arm up for so long? It's like something
holding
happens.
the microphone.
It's just like doing, doing.
I think you need a really good
Doing.
Portable mic stand.
So my arm is really strong. My right arm is really, 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 really strong. And so, holding down the fort is Alana Stewart, and she's not in the room, but she helps to propel what we make into the world. That's how she posts stuff so that you find it. Thank God you find it, Dan. But I think what happens is that, it's extremely intense. It's a very intense experience. Michelle, Veronica, and I do facilitate the sleepover. We also edit and ruminate over the edits. This is very much an art. I feel it's a piece of art. Like it's as much of a pyramid build as a feature movie is. I just finished writing and directing my second feature movie, and it's equally as physically and mentally arduous. And it's not for the faint of heart. It is for those extreme art communication lovers. I have a great team, and they're very committed and passionate and feel they are contributing something that is useful and entertaining for the world. Like I oftentimes feel like I would like to make work that hits your head, heart, and funny bone, and I feel like Sleepover does that. So it's not just a kind of like no one's, punching the time card, no one's bored. We're very, very engaged, and we have a very kind of, I think it's called a kind of, there's no top-down feeling. It's like we're really challenging one another. we're as engaged and interested in life and have very lively conversations about just what is affecting us. We're just a very wonderful peer group that challenge one another on making the best at it, honing our skills of story, and giving all we've got. I don't know very many people at all who would go in, who would sign up for this kind of thing. But luckily, we found one another, and it's a very dynamic team.
So again, let me ask you this question. This was a topic on a recent interview I did a little over a month ago. Tally Abacassis with First Day Back. She was a guest of mine, and we were talking about, it came up, it was sort of the hot topic at the time, was Brian Reed in S-Town and the work he did. And one of the things that was a hot topic with that show, as I'm sure you know, was sort of the idea of a journalistic distance or professional distance between sort of the subject of the story and yourselves. And Tally dealt with that in her season 2 for First Day Back, dealing with a woman who was, committed or convicted of a crime of accidentally shooting her husband and her entree back into the world. And so Tally and I talked about this, but you're out there doing this again and again and again, in the sense of you are learning about these people, and I imagine at some level getting close to them, if only for 24 hours, and I imagine longer in terms of the preparation and getting to know them and so on and so forth. Is that a difficulty for you or the team on not getting too close, but close enough to sort of solve these problems that you're going out to solve? And just what are your thoughts generally on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that journalistic balance is important, but it's a complex thing. I remember when I first went to the CBC, there was a kind of old school notion that the broadcaster must be this all-powerful knowing being, never reveal anything of their person, and be an expert only, which is really boring and is very patriarchal and not really true. And so I saw and witnessed the gradual kind of more kind of personal perspective being imbibed in other kinds of, like, you can hear that with a number of people from Howard Stern to Mark Maron to Ira Glass, like any number of journalists, even like what Vice is doing, it's imbibed with a bit more of a personal take. It does not need to be too personal, but at least you feel like you're not just dealing with a guy in a suit behind a desk telling you, in a authoritative voice that this is what's what. There's a bit more humanity there. At the same time, when you're covering things, I think it's really important, especially in the realm of news, to be balanced. You can't just run on one side and just completely disregard the polar perspective. So, I mean, it's a real balance. And I think each journalist must find their own kind of balance. And you're right, this is a very deep and intense experience that we are undergoing, experiencing together, making together. I could continue to take it home with me, but I think there is something that allows me to release that as well, and not completely turn my back on the guests. But I keep in contact through email. Sometimes I run into people on the streets, but I feel like there's a sort of sustaining kind of, in simply airing of a problem comes the ability to deal with it. And I feel like, most often, in fact, I can't think of any time where a person has left and felt overwhelmed even more by their problems. They kind of leave and go, okay, I think this is I can work with this now. Right. So there's something that just in the expression of what's bugging you is a great burden off one's shoulders. So I never feel like, oh God, like there are some people I know who are social workers who are really, kind of bring their work home with them and feel tremendous weight of their clients' difficulties. I think the difference is that there's no kind of therapist or expert. We're all got problems in there. So there's no kind of like, and usually when you pay for therapy, it's like you're the one on the couch There's usually a pretty specific power structure there. In this case, there's no expert. There's just people shooting the poop. And so there's it's a little bit easier. There was even a soldier that we had invited who, he lives with PTSD. Right. And, it was a concern. We had to make sure that everybody knew that, he has PTSD, that he could be triggered. We had to find out what were his triggers. We had to find out who we could call should he eventually, get triggered by something. We wanted everybody to be safe. Right. And so, but of course, we were willing to take that moment, take that possibility, and, everybody walked through the door and everybody was there on their own volition. And it was interesting even bringing up the notion of PTSD within, as a conversation point. And, the soldier Walter was saying, that's the thing, a lot of people think PTSD is this, like, I'm going to go gonzo. He's like, no, there's so much that people don't understand about PTSD. And it was sort of a learning experience that we could go, oh, okay, and hear more of what this one individual's experience was. And then a teenager, Devinder, who was another stranger in the room, he was like, I hate PST. Really? And we were like, what? He's like, provincial sales tax is so not fair. So there was so much laughter. Like, which therapist is going to say that? Right. So there's a kind of disarming, like suddenly Walter's not feeling like some, freaky guy who's going to blow. He's like a guy in the room talking about human stuff, and we can make some jokes, and just, and move through this. So, I mean, I think getting back to your point, yes, it is an intense experience. I think especially the three producers, Veronica Simmons, Michelle Malcolm, and I have put ourselves through a very intense experience and really deserve our summer off.
I will send the link to the live episode to CBC for you.
Let me tell you this. While I was doing season 2, I was also shooting my feature movie. So
what's that?
Yeah, so it was like, what? So I've been doing Sleepover during the day, and then at night I've been doing post and going to, do miscellaneous things like editing and so forth. So I do need a break.
That's a lot.
At the same time, I think my body has kind of like somehow transformed for me to be able to do this sort of stuff. But I look forward to sort of, getting a little simpler and maybe doing some relaxing, because I think that's a bad byproduct of being too busy, is like the need to be busy. I gotta be not busy.
This is just the living life version of the black box thing, right? You're now past that point of tired, and you're just beyond now at this point. Now you're all energized,
Oh, you're hilarious.
One last question for you before I let you go, Sook-Yin. I'm wondering, after release, because you're distilling 24 hours of tape into these, 30-minute episodes, usually focusing on one of each of the three guests.
Yeah.
What do the guests then give you in terms of feedback after the publication? I'm curious if they feel as if this was a great representation of sort of their story, or were there ever any concerns?
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, that's when you go talk about, journalistic bias and so forth, it's very important for us to kind of reflect what is going on in the room, and also be respectful to the person's story of which they have just shared with us, to do it accurately. And so there was one particular author, Sheila Hetty, in the first Sleepover. She was very reluctant to take part, but she finally did. And she's a very prudent and very specific writer, and she was concerned about how things would be. And she was like, how are you ever going to distill that so that it actually reflected our experience? And she heard it and she loved it. And she said, yes, that was accurate. So that's really based upon your chops. Awesome. That's that is the gold standard of which you must aim for if you're going to do a show like this, because the last thing you want to do is like not actually reflect or serve the situation accurately or fairly. So we have had none of our guests have been upset about any of the depictions. We do revisit them to see what becomes of their dilemma once they return to the real world. So it's been very interesting. Like, it's not every single instance is wrapped up in a pink bow. There are certain things that have very, very happy outcomes, and then other people, it's the same. Their problems kind of retain the same kind of charge or don't really change. And there's some people where other things come in that were unforeseen that kind of affect things. So it's sort of like I was saying, these problems are just a synonym for life, that life continues to go on, and life is a series of problem-solving moments, and that one problem will lead to another or morph into a different one, or maybe seem to, even out and get better, but then a new challenge arises. So it's always sort of in a morphing stage. So, there's one woman on season 2 who, her difficulty was she's in a kind of unfortunate conflict with her older brother, and she was afraid that she really didn't want to put words in his mouth, and she wanted to be able to illuminate his side, and I think. Well, that episode is yet to air, and I'll be interested to see what happens in her situation. She really didn't want to make the conflict worse.
Right.
And I'm hoping that it will be better. When I listen to the episode, I'm like, no, that is super. I feel that we were fair, and I feel like almost that I hope that it will. Maybe she could just forward email.
Yeah, it might help.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, you said it in that answer, Sook-Yin, which was gold standard, and we talked about a few other things that I think are applicable. Human connection, and I'll add must listen. I'll use all those to describe Sleepover. It's one of my favorites, and if folks, you're not listening to it, do yourself the favor and do so. And Sook-Yin, if you tell folks how they can do that, where they can find you on the socials, that would be great.
Sure. Okay, so it's you can find Sleepover CBC on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. Our website is cbc.ca/sleepover, and all of the material is there. All of our videos, all of season 1 and season 2, all of the audio. You can see gorgeous behind-the-scene photographs. Everything you ever wanted to know about Sleepover is there on our website. You can also download the podcast on iTunes. So if you will find it. You will find Sleepover on iTunes. Download it and subscribe to it, and it'll be in your inbox or whatever kind of radio app that you have to listen to podcasts. It's free. It's beautiful. It's it'll make you feel like okay about being alive. And there's all kinds of ways to find it, and it'll also be on CBC Radio 1 as well later this summer and through the fall. So. Just poke your nose around and you'll find it.
And links, as always, folks, will be in the show notes to all of that Sook-Yin just mentioned. And I want to thank you very much for taking the time to join me, Sook-Yin Lee from Sleepover. I'll enjoy the rest of the second season and hopefully look forward to more. Thank you very much for taking the time to join me.
Thanks, Dan, for your questions and also for your thoughtful presence.
All right, folks, so that'll do it for episode 146. Hope you enjoyed. Hope you go over and check out Sleepover. It is a super unique listening experience. Seriously, man, everything I said, I really think you guys will like it. Sook-Yin is a great guest to talk to. She's one of keeping in the back of my mind for a potential return visit in the future, maybe during season 3 or something. Really fun time talking with her. But before I let you go this week, folks, I want to let you know if you did enjoy this show, please share it on the social media. Tell a friend, will you? Another podcast-loving friend, or get somebody into podcasts. Tell them to tweet about it. Put it on their Facebook. Put it on their Instagram. Tell them to use the hashtag TPD so I can find it and interact with them and tell them, thank you so much. You're awesome for listening to this little show we've got here. A review on iTunes would be awesome. Click on the link in the show notes for Patreon to see if you want to support the show for as little as $1 a month would be super cool as well. But most importantly, thank you for listening. Thank you for the feedback in recent weeks. I hope you enjoyed the return to the long form interview here on episode 146. There's more to come, folks, I promise. So before I go, I want to take a moment and thank my show sponsor again this week, Podbean, podcast hosting and monetization. Easiest way to start podcasting, folks. My thanks to them. Go to podbean.com/TPD. Learn more. Get your first month for free. That'll do it for episode 146. Until next week for the Podcast Digest, folks, my name's Dan Lizette.